When I first found out about the business loan, I wasn't particularly shocked. My husband Daniel had always been good with finances, at least that's what I had believed. It was a quiet evening at home, and we had just finished dinner when he casually mentioned it over dessert. He looked at me, almost as if it was just another routine update. "I have taken out a small loan for the business," he said, his voice steady. "It'll help us cover some of the costs while I get things off the ground. Don't worry about it." I smiled, nodding, not thinking much of it. Daniel was ambitious, always looking for ways to expand, and I trusted him. But in the back of my mind, a nagging thought kept circling. Why hadn't he mentioned this before? Why hadn't we discussed it? But I brushed it off, telling myself he had his reasons. After all, we were a team, right? What was mine was his, and vice versa. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things. Daniel was often out late for business meetings, sometimes staying away overnight. When I would ask about his day, his responses became more vague. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both busy. But when I started looking at the household finances one evening, something didn't sit right. There were charges on the credit card that didn't seem to add up. Expensive dinners, shopping sprees, nothing that was related to the business at all. I could feel my stomach tighten as I scrolled through the transactions. There was no mention of a loan payment, no signs of the kind of financial responsibility I would have expected from Daniel. My mind raced. Something wasn't adding up, and I had to find out what it was. I began snooping around in places I never thought I'd have to. My first discovery came when I found a strange document tucked away in the back of his desk drawer, hidden beneath some old papers. It wasn't a business loan agreement, as he had told me. Instead, it was a credit statement from a bank I didn't recognize. The amount owed was far more than I had anticipated, way beyond the normal expenses for the business. There were also personal items listed that I knew Daniel had no use for. The more I looked, the more confused I became. But one detail caught my eye. The credit card was registered in a name that wasn't mine. It was tied to a woman's name, a name I had never heard before. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the paper. I felt a coldness wash over me. This wasn't just about a business loan anymore. There was something else, something I wasn't being told. For days I couldn't focus on anything but that credit card. The more I thought about it, the more I felt my trust slipping away. I found myself obsessing over every detail, combing through receipts, messages, and emails, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't just the money that bothered me. It was the realization that Daniel had been lying to me. The loan was a cover-up for something much bigger. As I dug deeper, I found the truth. Daniel had been using this money not for the business, but for another woman. He had been financing an entirely different life, one I had no idea existed. It started with a few small texts, messages that seemed innocent at first. But then I found an email thread between Daniel and a woman named Emily. The tone of the conversation made my blood run cold. He was arranging expensive weekend getaways, sending her gifts, and even planning to buy her a car. The woman wasn't just a friend or a business associate, she was his mistress. And the money he'd been borrowing wasn't for the business at all. It was all for her. My mind reeled with the discovery. I felt betrayed, angry, and most of all humiliated. All these years I had been supporting him, trusting him, believing in his dreams, and this is what he was doing behind my back. I wasn't just in the dark about his finances. I had been completely blindsided by the fact that he had been living a double life. The more I learned, the more furious I became. But I wasn't about to confront him just yet. No, I needed to gather more evidence. I had to make sure I had everything before I said a word. So I kept it all to myself, allowing the weight of his lies to grow heavier inside me. I watched him every day, taking mental notes of his behavior, and each time he walked out the door for another business meeting, I was one step closer to the truth. But there was something else that gnawed at me. He had been using my trust against me. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I wouldn't ask questions. But I was done being naive. I was done being in the dark. Then, one day, I found the final piece of the puzzle. I was at home, searching through his things one last time, when I found an envelope marked confidential. Inside was a bank statement detailing a large withdrawal. It wasn't just a payment to Emily or to some luxury store. It was a large deposit into an account that I knew nothing about. I stared at the numbers, the realization sinking in. Daniel had been funneling money into an account for Emily. He had been using our joint finances to cover up his affair and his secret life. The business loan was just a smokescreen, a way to hide the money he was spending on her. I had been living in a lie for so long, trusting him without question, and now everything was coming undone. That night, I waited for Daniel to come home. I was calm, too calm. He walked through the door, his usual smile fading when he saw the look on my face. I didn't say a word at first. I just handed him the envelope with the bank statement inside. His face went pale as he realized that I knew everything. He tried to explain, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want his lies anymore. I had spent too long living in the dark, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that the man I married was someone I could trust. But in that moment, I realized he had never been that person. He had been deceiving me for months, maybe even years. I let him talk, but I wasn't listening. I already knew what I needed to do. The loan, the mistress, the secret accounts, they were all the same thing. It was his betrayal, and I was done being the fool. I gathered my things, left the house, and told him I needed space to think. But in reality, I knew exactly what I had to do next. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. This was about taking back control, about refusing to let him manipulate me any longer. I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to make sure that he faced the consequences of what he had done. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer, making sure that I had everything in place before the real fallout began. He thought I was weak. He thought I wouldn't fight back. But he had no idea who he was really dealing with. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, phone calls, and decisions. Daniel tried everything to get me to forgive him. He promised to change, to make things right. But I knew that the man I had married was gone. What remained was someone who had broken my trust in the worst possible way. And as the days turned into weeks, I found strength I didn't know I had. I was no longer the woman who had believed in him blindly. I was someone who could stand on her own, someone who would no longer be taken for granted. In the end, Daniel lost everything. The money he had hidden away, the lies he had built his affair upon, it all came crashing down. And as I walked away from him, I finally felt free. Free from the lies, free from the betrayal, and free from the man who had thought he could control me. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to rebuild my life. This time, on my own terms. The first few days after Daniel's discovery were the hardest. I was overwhelmed with a flood of emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness. But more than anything, I felt humiliated. All these years of building a life together, only for him to hide something so monstrous from me. It wasn't just the financial lies or the business loan. It was the fact that he had been living another life behind my back. His affair wasn't just an emotional betrayal, but a financial one as well. He had used my trust, my belief in our future, to fuel his selfish desires. As I went through the motions of daily life, pretending to be fine, my mind couldn't stop running through the details of everything I had uncovered. I started to feel like I was living in two different worlds. On the surface, everything appeared normal. My friends, family, work colleagues, they all thought I had a perfect marriage. I had built my life around that image, and for a while I believed it too. But now everything was cracking. The image I had of Daniel, of our life together, was shattered. And I had to face the harsh truth. The man I thought I knew wasn't the person I had married. The evenings were the hardest. When I lay in bed, the silence was deafening. I used to fall asleep to the sound of Daniel's steady breathing, the warmth of his body next to mine. Now, all I could hear were the lies he had whispered to me over the years. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the woman he had been spending his money on, the lavish gifts he had bought her, and the trips he had planned, all the while I had been working hard to support us both. I had always believed that we were in this together, but now I knew the truth. I was nothing more than a pawn in his game of deception. The phone calls and texts from Daniel started coming in the day after I left. At first, he begged for forgiveness. He promised that he never meant for things to get this far, that it was a mistake, and that he was willing to do anything to make it right. I ignored his calls. I couldn't bear to hear his voice. It was as though he thought a few words of apology could erase the damage he had done, but I wasn't falling for it. Not anymore. Instead, I focused on what I needed to do next. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him walk away from this unscathed. No, this was bigger than me. This was about my dignity, my self-worth, and my future. I couldn't let him continue to manipulate me, to use me as his safety net while he played the part of the successful businessman with a happy home life. He thought I was weak. He thought I wouldn't stand up for myself. But he was wrong. I spent hours researching my options. I contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in divorce and financial fraud. I needed to make sure that I had every angle covered. My lawyer was supportive but firm, advising me to take my time and gather as much evidence as possible. I had already collected a good amount: credit card statements, emails, and even text messages that painted a clear picture of Daniel's affair. But I needed more. I needed to make sure that when I confronted him, I had the upper hand. In the meantime, Daniel didn't give up. He kept texting, sending me flowers, and even showed up at my office one afternoon, desperate for a chance to talk. I kept my distance, not responding to any of his pleas. It was clear that he didn't fully understand the magnitude of what he had done. He thought he could win me back with gifts and words, but I was no longer that woman. I had seen the truth, and I wasn't going to pretend anymore. There was a small part of me that wanted to confront him right away. I wanted to yell, to throw everything I had discovered in his face and watch him squirm. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't bring me the justice I deserved. I wasn't going to let my emotions drive me to rash decisions. Instead, I would wait. I would wait for the right moment, and when it came, I would make sure he paid for what he had done, not just to me, but to our entire relationship. I spent the days leading up to the confrontation preparing myself. I called my best friend Sarah to talk things through. She was there for me, listening without judgment, offering support when I needed it most. It was during these conversations that I began to realize something important. Daniel's affair and the debt were just symptoms of a much larger problem: his lack of respect for me. He had thought he could live this double life without any consequences, but I was going to make sure that he couldn't hide anymore. And so the days passed, each one bringing me closer to the moment of truth. I knew that when I confronted him, things would never be the same. There would be no going back, but I was ready. It was time to take control, to stop being the victim of his lies, and to make him face the consequences of his actions. The weight of everything I had learned hung heavily on me, but I wasn't going to let it break me. Instead, it fueled me, pushing me to be stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. The moment I had been preparing for was almost here. The confrontation finally came a few days later, when I could no longer put it off. I had everything in place: evidence, a plan, and the cold resolve to follow through. It was a Saturday evening, and Daniel was home early for once, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone as though nothing had changed. As I entered the room, I could feel the tension thick in the air. He looked up at me, his face lighting up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, babe. I've been trying to reach you all day," he said, his voice too calm, too practiced. He was pretending that everything was fine, pretending that his lies had not been exposed. I said nothing, simply walking past him to sit down at the kitchen table. He followed me, his footsteps heavy, but I could hear his nervousness creeping in. He knew. "I know what's going on," I said, my voice steady but firm. It wasn't a question, but a statement. He froze, his eyes widening as the blood drained from his face. I know about the loan, the mistress, the money you've been hiding. The words were heavy, the truth crashing down around us. He stammered, trying to find the right words, but there was nothing he could say. His usual calm and collected demeanor vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. "Sarah, listen. This isn't what you think," he began, his voice shaking. "I can explain everything. It's not what you think. I was just trying to help with the business, and Emily—" "Don't," I interrupted, cutting him off. "Don't even try. I've seen the documents, Daniel. I know about the credit card, the trips, the gifts. I know about the money you've been pouring into her life while I've been at home, keeping everything together. You used me, used my trust to cover your lies." His face crumpled as I spoke, and for a moment I thought he might break down. But then, the anger rose in his eyes, and he tried to regain control. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, his tone now defensive. "This is about business. It's not about her. It's about making things work for us, for our future." I couldn't believe how far he was going to protect his own lies, twisting the situation to make it seem like I was the one overreacting. "A business loan?" I repeated bitterly. "A business loan that was never about business at all? Don't insult me, Daniel. This is about you hiding behind a mask of responsibility while you were giving your money, and your time, elsewhere." His hands trembled slightly, his eyes flicking to the side as if looking for a way out of the conversation. But there was no escape anymore. The truth was laid out in front of him, and he couldn't deny it. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, but the remorse in his voice felt empty. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could fix it. I didn't want to lose everything." I shook my head, feeling a lump form in my throat. "It's too late for that, Daniel. You already did. You've been lying to me for months, maybe even years. You thought you could juggle it all. Keep me here. Keep me believing in our future while you were building one with someone else. How could you?" He fell silent then, his eyes wide, not sure how to respond. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything he had done settling between us like a heavy wall. I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I kept it under control. There was no need to raise my voice. I had the upper hand now, and he knew it. "I've already contacted a lawyer," I said quietly. "You've been hiding money from me, Daniel. You've been using our finances, our savings to cover your lies. This isn't just an affair anymore. It's financial fraud. I'm taking steps to protect myself. I'm filing for divorce, and I'll make sure everything is sorted out legally." His face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But there were no words left that would undo what he had done. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. "I'm done," I repeated, more to myself than to him. "And you will pay for this, Daniel. Not just emotionally, but legally. You can't escape this. You can't play this off as just a mistake anymore." There was a beat of silence before he tried to plead again, but I was already done listening. My mind was made up, and I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. As I stood up and gathered my things, I glanced back at him one last time, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no guilt, no hesitation. "I want you to leave," I said, the words leaving my mouth with a finality that I hadn't expected. "I want you to leave and don't come back. I'll handle everything from here. This is over." I could see the shock in his eyes, the disbelief that he had lost control of the situation. But this time it wasn't going to be his choice. This time I was in control. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't the same woman who had married him years ago. I had changed, and in some ways, I felt like I had shed an old skin. I wasn't going to be his victim anymore. I was walking away, not just from him, but from the lies, from the betrayals, from everything that had kept me in the dark for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I was finally free. The days that followed were a blur. I felt a mix of relief and confusion, but the relief was starting to take over. I had done it. I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life, and while it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniel wasn't going to just let go of the life we had built together. He had already started his attempts to reach me, sending text after text, leaving voicemail after voicemail. I ignored them all, determined to stay strong. His messages ranged from desperate pleas for forgiveness to angry accusations. One minute he was saying how sorry he was, promising to change, and the next he was calling me cold-hearted and vindictive for throwing everything away over a little mistake. I couldn't help but feel a wave of disgust every time I read his words. How could he still think this was just a little mistake? How could he minimize the magnitude of his betrayal? I had given him everything, my trust, my love, my support, and this was what I got in return. It was during this time that I began to reflect on how much of my life I had spent trying to make things work with him. I had given up parts of myself to make him happy, to support him in his career, to be the wife he wanted. And for what? So he could keep secrets from me, lie to me, and betray everything we had built together. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But I knew that anger wouldn't help me now. It wouldn't fix anything. What I needed was a plan. A solid plan to make sure that Daniel faced the consequences of his actions. I kept seeing the same image in my mind. Daniel, with his smug smile, thinking that he could get away with it. I had always been the one to forgive, to move past things. But this time I wasn't going to let him off the hook. This time he was going to pay, and not just emotionally. He was going to face the financial fallout of his lies, and he was going to face the legal consequences as well. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me getting revenge. It was about standing up for myself, for the woman I had become. This was about taking control of my life and my finances. Daniel had thought he could manipulate me, hide the truth, and walk away without facing any repercussions. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to be a doormat anymore. I reached out to the lawyer I had contacted earlier and began discussing the next steps in the divorce proceedings. The more we spoke, the clearer it became that Daniel had crossed a line. His affair wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of everything I had worked for. We discussed the financial fraud, the debt he had accumulated under false pretenses, and how it had affected not just our marriage, but our financial security. My lawyer was confident that I would be entitled to a large portion of the assets, and possibly more given the circumstances of Daniel's actions. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about making sure that he couldn't continue with his lies, that he couldn't cover his tracks any longer. It was about making sure he would never have the opportunity to do this to anyone else. I had to protect myself, and I had to make sure he knew that his actions had consequences. The next few days were filled with paperwork, meetings with the lawyer, and tense moments where I could feel the weight of the decisions I was making. There were times when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But then I would think about the things I had discovered, the loans, the affair, the lies, and I would remember why I had to do this. Daniel's calls continued, but I started to get a sense of his desperation. He was unraveling, and for the first time I could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He wasn't the strong, confident man I had married. He was just a man caught in a web of lies, and he knew it. He was losing control of everything, and I wasn't going to save him this time. The tipping point came when I received an email from Daniel's lawyer. It was clear he was preparing for a fight. He wanted to settle things quietly, without going to court. But I knew better than that now. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. This wasn't going to be something I just moved past for the sake of convenience. I had to make sure that I was heard, that my side of the story was known. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and responded, letting him know that I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. If Daniel wanted to play games, then I was ready to play harder. I wasn't going to back down. The next few days were a blur of legal back and forths, heated arguments with Daniel over the phone, and emotional exhaustion. But I knew I was getting closer to the end, closer to the moment when I could finally breathe freely again. I could almost taste the freedom, the feeling of being in control of my life once more. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take much more, Daniel sent me a message that made everything clear. It was a simple text. I don't want to lose you. Please, let's fix this. I stared at it for a long time, letting the words sink in, and for a brief moment I felt a pang of regret. Maybe this could be fixed. Maybe there was a way to save what we had. But then I remembered everything I had uncovered. The affair, the debt, the lies, and I realized something. What Daniel wanted wasn't to fix the marriage. It was to fix himself, to keep his life from falling apart. I wasn't his safety net anymore. I wasn't going to be the one he used to cover his mistakes. He had made his bed and now he had to lie in it. I put the phone down and made my decision. There was no going back. I was done. The day of the final meeting with my lawyer arrived, and the reality of everything that had been happening finally began to set in. There was no going back now. The divorce papers were ready, the financial settlement documents prepared, and the final step was all that remained. My hands shook slightly as I went through the last of the paperwork, but I felt a sense of resolve I hadn't experienced in years. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotional highs and lows, but now I was standing at the edge of something new. I had spent too long in a marriage that had stifled me, trapped me in a world of lies and betrayal. Daniel had been controlling, not just with the money, but with my feelings, my trust. He had taken advantage of my willingness to believe in him, of my desire to make our marriage work. But now I was free. Free from the manipulation, free from the fear of his lies. I left the lawyer's office that afternoon with a sense of finality. I had filed for divorce and the legal proceedings were moving forward. Daniel had been served with the papers earlier that week, and although I wasn't sure how he would respond, I felt the smallest flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, I was living life on my own terms, and it felt good. The days following were filled with tension. Daniel didn't take it well, of course. He tried every tactic he could think of to get me to change my mind. He sent more texts, more emails, each one pleading for forgiveness. He reminded me of the good times, the memories we had shared. But I wasn't swayed. Each message just confirmed what I had already known. Daniel was doing everything he could to keep his life intact without facing the consequences. He was trying to salvage the pieces of a broken marriage, but I wasn't going to let him. Then came the final twist in the saga. One evening, as I was going through some of the last remaining documents, I received a call from my lawyer. He informed me that Daniel had made one last attempt to settle things quietly. He had offered me a lump sum of money in exchange for not pursuing the divorce further. It was an offer that seemed almost generous, considering the circumstances, but something about it felt off. I thought about the offer for a moment, weighing the possibility. But then I realized something. Daniel wasn't offering me this money out of kindness. He was trying to buy his way out of accountability. He wanted me to walk away from the truth, from everything I had uncovered, without holding him fully responsible. I couldn't do that. Not after everything he had put me through. The anger I had tried to suppress flared up again. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was determination. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to let him escape the consequences of his actions. He had thought he could control everything, that he could manipulate me into forgiving him. But I was done. I called my lawyer back and rejected the offer. If Daniel wants to settle, he can do it in court, I told him. I want everything. I want the full financial settlement. I want him to face the consequences of his lies, and I want to make sure this is all documented so he can't hide anything else from me. As I hung up the phone, I felt a wave of relief. It was over. Daniel's last attempt to control the situation had failed. The next step was inevitable, the final court hearing, and I was ready for it. I had already made up my mind. I was no longer the woman who had been blindly trusting, who had believed in her husband's promises. I was someone who knew the value of standing up for herself, of taking charge of her own life and her own future. But even as the papers were being filed and the process moved forward, there was one last thing on my mind. Emily, the woman who had been at the center of it all. I didn't know if she was aware of the full extent of Daniel's deceit, but I knew one thing for sure. She was just as much a part of this as he was. I debated for a while whether I should reach out to her to make sure she knew the truth about Daniel, but in the end I decided against it. I didn't want to get entangled in that mess any further. Daniel had made his choices, and it wasn't my job to clean up his mess. I had enough to deal with on my own. In the end, everything happened exactly as I had planned. The divorce was finalized, and the legal settlement ensured that I was financially secure. I wasn't just walking away with the money, though. I was walking away with my dignity, my self-respect, and a renewed sense of strength. I had made it through the worst of it, and I had come out on top. And as for Daniel, well, I hadn't heard from him much after the final hearing. I heard through mutual friends that he was struggling to pick up the pieces of his life, but honestly, it didn't concern me anymore. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The man who had once meant everything to me was now a stranger, a part of my past that I was ready to leave behind. I stood at the edge of the life I had built on my own, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. It would be mine to shape. And that was enough for me. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change, but they were also some of the most liberating months of my life. I moved into a new place, far from the house Daniel and I had shared, and it felt like stepping into a fresh chapter. The house had always been full of memories of a life I thought was real, a life I thought I had built with someone I could trust. But it no longer felt like home. It was just a building, a reminder of the woman I used to be, the woman who believed in love, in loyalty, in a partnership that was built on honesty. That woman was gone. I began to reclaim pieces of myself that I had long lost. I threw myself into work, focusing on my career, building it back up. I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been drained by Daniel, by the lies, the secrets, and the constant emotional toll his behavior had taken on me. But now, I had room to breathe. I had room to grow, and I did. I found a new sense of purpose, a new drive that had been buried under years of sacrifice and compromise. I started taking care of myself in ways I had never done before. I went to therapy, worked on my mental and emotional well-being, and started reconnecting with friends and family. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I was healing. Not just from the hurt Daniel had caused, but from all the ways I had let myself be held back. I wasn't the woman who had tolerated the lies and deceit anymore. I was someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. And as I started rebuilding, I began to feel more at peace than I had in a long time. There were moments, of course, when the loneliness crept in, the quiet evenings, the empty spaces. I would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if I would ever feel the same kind of love again. But then I reminded myself of how far I had come, how much I had survived. And slowly, those moments of doubt began to fade. I knew now that I didn't need someone else to complete me. I was complete on my own. Months turned into a year, and I found myself standing in a place I never thought I would reach. I had not only survived the betrayal, but I had thrived in spite of it. The fear and sadness that once gripped me had been replaced with confidence and strength. I no longer carried the weight of Daniel's lies. I had let go of the resentment, the anger, and the bitterness. The only thing I carried now was the knowledge that I was in control of my own story. And then one day I received an email. It was from Daniel's lawyer, asking if I would consider meeting with him one last time to discuss a potential settlement. My first instinct was to ignore it, to leave the past exactly where it belonged, in the past. But something inside me urged me to at least hear him out. I agreed to the meeting, knowing it wasn't going to change anything. When I sat across from Daniel in that sterile conference room, his face was different. It was older, more tired. He looked like someone who had been worn down by his own lies. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain himself. But I didn't need to hear it anymore. I didn't need the closure he was offering. The closure I needed had already come. It had come when I decided to take control of my life. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time, I felt no anger, no sadness, just indifference. I'm done, Daniel, I said, my voice steady and calm. I've already made peace with what happened, and I've already moved on. You should too. There was a long silence. I could see the weight of my words settling in, and I knew it was over. There was no going back for either of us. As I walked out of the meeting, I felt lighter than I had in years. I was finally free from everything he had done to me. The years of lies, the emotional manipulation, the affair, all of it was gone. It no longer held any power over me. I was free to move forward, to embrace the future with the strength I had found within myself. And as I stood outside in the fresh air, feeling the weight of the past fall away, I smiled. Because I knew one thing for sure. I had learned how to love myself again. And that was all I needed. The future was mine to shape, and I was ready.